as much as it may sound shocking when you say the 6-year-old might have a gun. And I think most people's reaction was like, there's no way there's no way that's accurate, right? I mean, some people might say that. We're in a world right now where the threat is real and these things are happening quite frequently, where if somebody says that, we need to take that seriously.
You're listening to Talking About Guns, or TAG as we like to call it. My name is Matt Littman. I'm Executive Director of 97%. We're a new bipartisan organization working to reduce gun deaths in America. As part of our mission to change the conversation around gun safety, TAG normalizes dialogue about guns. We invite guests from all sides of the gun debate and talk about the hot button issues, but without the screaming. My guest today is a former national security official who began her career working in the Pentagon as a Bush appointee following the September 11th attacks. Most recently, she served as Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor to Vice President Mike Pence. She has worked on security efforts in the aftermath of numerous mass shootings. A gun owner and self-described proud defender of the Second Amendment, she's also spoken about her passion for protecting Americans from the increase in gun violence across this country. This fall, she joined 97%'s advisory board. Olivia Troye, welcome to TAG.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for having me.
So folks know, Olivia, you, as we mentioned in the introduction, national security for Vice President Pence, and now you're, amongst other things, you're on the advisory board for 97% because this issue is really important to you. But can you tell us a little bit more about why you're involved in gun safety, why you care about this so much?
Yeah, sure. Like this has been something that's been important to me for many years now. It's something, gun violence has touched my own family on a personal level. My aunt was in the Walmart in El Paso when that shooter was there, and that hate crime that was so awful that impacted my community. That's the community I grew up in. And although she was okay, thank goodness, I always say it's a guardian angel that did it, or something to that effect. There was a younger woman when the shooter turned and looked directly at my aunt. She looked straight at him. This woman grabbed her and pulled her away and literally dragged her because my aunt is elderly and she was frozen. And that woman saved her life. And I can't tell you how hard it was to work on that shooting because I was at the White House at the time in my role as Homeland Security Advisor to Vice President Pence at the time. And to realize that there was a mass shooting in my hometown, and to realize also that my aunt had been in that Walmart when it was happening. And so I actually got like a real-time description, somewhat of a description directly from my family. And I will never forget that moment where I walked to the West Wing and I was questioned about it. And I said, well, I can tell you this because my aunt saw him. And I never thought those words would ever come out of my mouth. And I had worked a lot of mass shootings by that point, especially in that role, in the aftermath and the follow through on it. And each one of them is just awful. So I just hope that, I think it's important. Look, I grew up in a gun-friendly household. I guess my parents owned guns. I'm not an anti-gun person per se, but I am certainly anti this violence and increasing gun violence that we're seeing in our country. And I certainly, I joined the 97% board because I think that this is the way forward. It's going to take gun owners and non-gun owners coming together and really working together to progress in this area, which is why it's something that really matters to me. And I think that's the only path. And hopefully we can make a difference and sort of have people listen and have open conversations about this. Of how do we meet in the middle? Because this is just ongoing and it's awful.
So first, thank you. Giving your life to public service. You've worked in some very difficult circumstances. You're involved now in this issue, which is a very difficult issue. So just first, thank you. Second, when you say, Olivia, that you were involved as Homeland Security for the VP, and I guess if you're in the West Wing for the president as well, how does that manifest itself? What exactly are you doing in that role that has to do with those mass shootings?
Yeah, so I, as its Homeland Security advisor, I was also detailed from the Department of Homeland Security. So I say that specifically because I was very plugged into this world that deals with domestic terrorism, that deals with domestic incidents. And in that role, I specifically covered all domestic type of crisis events. So anything that would fall under the purview of Homeland Security fell under me. I mean, we're talking mass shootings, we're talking domestic terrorism, we're talking natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, anything of the sort was my responsibility. And in that role, when an incident like this happens, whenever there is a major situation like this, it's my responsibility to get ground truth almost immediately, because I have to be informing the vice president directly. And on these situations, they're so fast moving that I would brief him directly on every single one. That was my role. And so it was to get credible information. And a lot of it was working in the coordination with FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and other agencies or law enforcement, state and local entities. And a lot of it was really plugging into DHS and figuring out what was really happening, understanding, and especially figuring out what the risk was to the community, the ongoing threat of the situation, and really just kind of following up on the aftermath of it as well. It's just figuring out also in the follow-up what happened. And you know, and a lot of that is also policy work. It's policy work in the aftermath of, okay, we had the situation. What do we know about it? What was the social media? What were the parameters on it? All of these things are sort of worked in this sort of apparatus that happens in the National Security Council. It's a little different, I would say, for the people that serve in the roles. So I'm in a Homeland Security advisor directly for the vice president, because in many ways, you don't have the layers. So you really have to be accurate in your information, because they're going out and talking to the public sometimes immediately or addressing it. And it, you know, look, this role is not political. I will say that very clearly in nature. You're really there in these types of scenarios to address factual information and make sure that, you know, the leader of the country is able to speak to it and really respond as needed and figure out where it stands. And then, you know, yes, I oftentimes I got phone calls from the president's team. I was known for having been in the community for a long time. And so I sometimes would have access to information that was in real time, more accurate. I had, you know, I know a lot of the people in the community that work in this space. And a lot of the time you start to recognize the signs, right? When you've been working on the domestic and law enforcement front of it, of what it is and what it could be, and what it isn't. And I always used to say, it's also important to be very diligent, right? And kind of weed through what's real information,
Right.
and also make sure that it's accurate,
Right.
so that you're not misinforming the public, because that's really critical at the time. And sometimes first reports are wrong. So you've got to be very, very careful.
So I don't think I realized that Homeland Security is anything that affects the security of the United States, not just terrorism, but anything. You said like a hurricane or a tornado or something. I didn't realize that gets covered under Homeland Security as well. But when you deal with this type of issue, did you notice when you were there that you were dealing with this type of issue, these mass shootings, more frequently, and that this was taking up more? Yeah.
Yes, I will say that I do remember specifically the first major one was the synagogue in Pittsburgh that I was covering. And I remember that one because of the fact that the shooter had posted on Gab. He had posted on more the dark web immediately before going to the synagogue. I had been starting to track these things just because I was really concerned about the rise of domestic terrorism and anti-Semitism and in that space from my tenure at DHS right before I got to the White House. And so I was watching this kind of happen, and I was looking for trends on what was happening here between posting on the dark web and then carrying it out. I've also I had worked on the Christchurch situation. I had to brief on that because I also covered global terrorism. I basically had the breaking events portfolio. So pretty much mass shootings around the world or terrorism around the world that was immediate, not necessarily regionally focused, fell under me. So it was like, look, my nickname was a bad news bear. So that tells you
these shootings, though, Olivia, these shootings, though, don't qualify necessarily as domestic terrorism. Should they be? What's the difference between a mass shooting and domestic terrorism currently?
Well, so it depends, I think, and that is why we struggle. I think, especially in the United States, is just so domestic terrorism is more considered an act of where you're engaging in an act of pushing a political agenda or pushing it for a racially motivated hate crime or a religious purpose. That tends to be the more angle of how we define domestic terrorism here in the United States. I say it's challenging because I think sometimes we get stuck on how do we define domestic terrorism. And I'll say this because we've had these policy discussions in the national security apparatus of how do you truly define that versus, I mean, like what we saw earlier this week, right, with the California shootings. I don't know. I mean, that doesn't meet the qualifier of domestic terrorism. That is someone who, for whatever angry reason, we're still working through all the motives, does a mass shooting in that way. And so there's a fine line here of how you separate that out. Right. But I guess in my world, like gun violence, my whole purpose in life, especially in that role, was to keep Americans safe regardless.
Well, that seems like an impossible job, right? I mean, that's impossible. Do you feel that in that job, though, what do you think the difference is that you were able to bring to the table?
I think, sort of looking at it from a lens of trying to understand all the different aspects that we are facing here domestically in our country in terms of gun violence and the increasing gun crimes as well. I think a piece of it that I definitely think about and don't separate is I don't think that you can really separate increasing gun violence in our country and separate it from hate and divisiveness that's happening in our country, because I do believe that that is driving an aspect of it that we're seeing, whether it's people feeling ostracized. I don't think that we can separate it from current world events, right? We saw a lot of people that were impacted during the COVID pandemic. There's certainly a mental health aspect to this that is taking place here. So I think I take a step back and I look at this sort of broader spectrum of sort of the congruence of all of these factors they are playing into what is happening across our country. I mean, we've had, I don't even know the number exactly, 40 shootings since the start of the year. I don't know if that's accurate.
You're talking about mass shootings?
Mass shootings,
Mass shootings, yes. Different people characterize it by different numbers, but right. Yes, there are more than. So today we're taping this 40. On the 20, I don't know what today is, 25th or 26th. There have been more than 25 or 26 mass shootings. And that's true throughout the year. We cover, the news covers, Olivia, as you well know, these enormous, very scary mass shootings, but there are also mass shootings that occur every day that do not get covered. And then right. There are the issues of suicides that don't get covered, and those make up the majority of deaths. But I want to, as you were talking, I was just making sure I was reading something correctly. A note that Stephanie had sent to me earlier on domestic. Stephanie is our communications person for the people listening to this, on domestic terrorism. And if we were able to characterize mass shootings as domestic terrorism, are there other things that we could bring to the table that would help diminish the number of mass shootings if we were able to start characterizing them as domestic terrorism?
Yeah, I think that there's a number of things I'll say that the community has struggled with in this space in terms of how do you make a difference in it, whether it's a combination of looking for tell signs of when there's signs that someone has been radicalized per se. And I say that domestic radicalization is a big key here in terms of that. And certainly, like, we got to just say it, that social media certainly plays a role, and a lot of the tell signs are there. A lot of the indicators are there when individuals talk about violence, when they're talking about potentially carrying out violence. This happens beforehand. And so there's certainly an aspect of how do we start to curb sort of these situations when it comes to aspects of social media in terms of that. But I think that those are very challenging conversations, especially in the United States, because of our rights in terms of freedom and our privacy rights and our freedom of speech. And I think that is where other countries, I think, have had an easier time, where they do more of the monitoring online, where they actually are able to flag things ahead of time. We, I think, are still struggling with that. And that's something, we're in a world where even partnering with social media companies sometimes gets taken out of context. And I think those are very honest conversations that we need to have with ourselves in terms as Americans and legislators, and really just speak honestly about what is happening here, if we can actually make a difference in that space by having those tough conversations and working with social media companies on it.
So it's interesting, right? Because it brings up First Amendment issues, Big Brother issues. And then we saw a couple of cases where we saw the 6-year-old shoot his teacher at a school. And the 6-year-old, I think the school was warned 3 times that the kid may have a gun, right? And then in Monterey Park, I believe that shooter went to the police about a couple of weird things a couple of times, went to the police station, right? I mean, so it's
Right.
There's a social media part of it, and then are people paying enough attention when they know something is wrong part of it. And I'm wondering if we need people to just pay more attention. I don't know that people understand that, when somebody says a 6-year-old may have a gun, they may have a gun. Right? Like, I feel, that maybe they didn't take it seriously enough. When the guy is coming into a police station a couple of times to talk about things that are sort of conspiracy theory type things, maybe we ought to be paying more attention. That's just a person showing up and that happening, much less online. Is there a way? So I don't know that the social media companies would want to partner on something like that. Do you have some sense of where that would be in terms of they're allowing Homeland Security, for example, to look into that kind of thing when somebody's making a threat, which does happen all the time?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I know that they have an easier time overseas. I know that they've made progress with other countries on this space. And when you talk about when you talk about issues like terrorist use of the internet, it's certainly sort of a topic that's easier to grapple with. It is a harder topic when it comes to the United States. But I think to your other points about the signs are there, and it's just, I think we need to get more in the mindset of, maybe we'll look back on like 9/11, right? When people were more vigilant to see something, say something. I think you and I have actually talked about this previously, Matt, where it's really, we need to be in a moment where we need to, as much as it may sound shocking when you say the 6-year-old might have a gun, and I think most people's reaction was like, there's no way that's accurate, right? I mean, some people might say that. We're in a world right now where the threat is real, and these things are happening quite frequently, where if somebody says that, we need to take that seriously. Or if somebody is coming in, you need to follow up on that. You need to follow up if somebody has a record with the law. But, and that also, we can go down the conversation of we can go down the conversation of then we go into the gun permits and the background checks and why all of this sort of plays together as well on that, right? Because I think we're in a moment right now where when there's a sign of something, we do need to follow up on that lead. We can no longer be passive about it. We need to start being more proactive, and the communities need to start being more proactive. Americans need to start paying more attention, because, I mean, these types of situations, like shootings like this, are really one of the most major threats we are facing in our communities. I was listening to something where there's a lot of parents right now that are super scared about sending their children to school right now, because they're sort of starting to live in fear about what's going to happen to them.
Yeah, when that LA County shooter in Monterey Park, he was on the loose. And, just as an example, my kid was going to a farmer's market in LA, and we were nervous about her going, with that shooter driving around in a van. Then we have to say to the kids, like, be careful, basically. Even if you tell them to be careful, what are they being careful of? I mean, how do they even know? What are they supposed to do? And I think a lot of people are, now you go to the movies, you look for the exit. People get nervous in big crowds now. This is a relatively new phenomenon. And Olivia, I wanted to bring up with you, which is, we did all this research with Dr. Michael Siegel at Tufts University, and we put together this roadmap. And one of the things that Dr. Siegel talks about is the need for people who've committed misdemeanor violent acts to not be able to get a gun, as opposed to just felony violent acts. Sometimes, as you know, no doubt, a felony gets sent down to a misdemeanor to make it easier to prosecute or some such thing. And so we have people who have committed violent crimes, but they're misdemeanors, who are able to get a gun. What do you think about that idea?
I think that's I thought that was a valid finding. I think, I think that's another loophole in the laws, right? That allows bad actors.
Yeah.
It gives them an opportunity to purchase guns. And I think we need to be closing that loophole. I think that would be a big step in the right direction. And and to be honest, Matt,
yeah,
I talk to gun owners all the time. I don't know that any gun owner would oppose that. Right?
Yeah,
it shouldn't be that hard.
Right. So we talk about this a lot too, which is, and you and I have probably talked about it before, which is that most people agree. I mean, this is, almost everybody agrees on these issues. Very few people, but they're loud when they disagree. And I think those loud voices very often get heard. And we need more people like you and your voice heard, because you're an expert on a lot of these subjects, which, by the way, as an aside, you take on some very difficult subjects.
I seem to have a habit of that. Yes. I'm recognizing a pattern of behavior for myself, unfortunately.
Right. That is, none of this is easy. I mean, working on national security issues is difficult. Working on gun issues is difficult. So, thank you. But I hope that at some point you also take on issues that are a little bit easier, because this is tough stuff. You're still a member of the Republican Party, correct?
I call myself a recovering Republican because I don't identify with a lot of the tenets that it seems to have right now. It's just not.
Well, let's talk about the gun issue thing specifically, though. Do you think there are members of the Republican Party in the House, for example, that favor gun reforms, but there aren't that many? And then obviously we saw some senators, such as Senator Cornyn, come out in favor of gun reforms a few months ago, and we were able to get that gun reform package passed. What do you think the Republican Party is missing on the gun issue?
More leadership. Honestly, quite frankly, I think, I was really happy when Senator Cornyn took the lead, especially after Uvalde, but it took Uvalde for that to happen.
Right.
Right. And that is what's, I think, so upsetting at times, is that it takes something like that to be the catalyst for someone to finally take a stand. And I really, I've said this on other issues as well. I think there's a major difference to be made if these Republican leaders who do understand the importance of taking on this issue would come together and actually take leadership in it. And I do believe that others would follow. But it has to be almost like a coalition of the willing that comes together. And I think, honestly, to make a difference in this space, it's going to have to come from the Republican side. It's going to have to come from them.
When you were in the previous administration, there was a moment where the former president seemed to favor gun reforms. And then literally the NRA came to him, and then that was the end of that, which would have been a chance, I thought, for good leadership to say, here are the reforms that everybody favors. And I think he got scared and came out against it after coming out for it. So how do we, now you're going to have a 2024 presidential run. A lot of these candidates are not going to come out in favor of gun reforms. How do we make change? Is it more on a local level than it is on a national level? Where do you think, because you're doing it, right? And we have a bunch of people, for example, on our advisory board, Congressman Curbelo, Congressman Charlie Dent, Congressman Joe Walsh. Interestingly, they're all former members of Congress. So they feel more free to speak out, I think, than if they were in Congress now. So how do we, what if a Republican, for example, wants to speak out on gun reform? What advice do you have?
I think you should listen to your constituents, because I think that they will find that the support is there for it if they actually go out. And I think once they start talking about it, I think they're going to see that Americans want this type of change. They want to see this reform. It's become this like taboo issue on the Republican side, and it really shouldn't be. This is about, it's common sense at this point that something needs to be done. And so I would say, like, once you start to talk about it, canvass your own communities, and you're going to find that there's going to be support for it. And then find the others that are wanting to move the ball forward. But I think you're right. I think it's going to happen more at the local level. Maybe at the congressional level. I don't think that you're going to see a national candidate running on gun reform anytime soon, especially on the Republican side. I just don't. Yeah. I don't see that happening. Yeah. So, unfortunately.
First, I want to, as we said, I want to thank you for the amount of work that you're doing on a lot of important issues. You're a valuable, vital member of our advisory board. And I want to ask you, at the end of each episode, we ask a guest to tag somebody they'd like to have come on the podcast with us. Olivia, who would you like to tag as a podcast guest?
It's a great question. I think, honestly, I think you should talk to Nancy Mace.
The Congresswoman from Kansas? Is that where she's from?
No, she's from South Carolina.
South Carolina, Nancy Mace. Republican Congresswoman.
She's a former military, I believe.
Okay.
Served in the military. She's a Republican Congresswoman. I think she's always been one that kind of, obviously she is on the Republican side, but I think that she takes a stand as needed. I think she would be an interesting person to talk to on this issue. I think she's pretty open-minded on things, and she's also a person that listens to her constituents quite a bit. I think that would be a completely interesting perspective to have, just an open conversation and see how she sees it. I do think that it's going to be baby steps, but I think, like, I always look at NRA as the bully, and I'm a big believer that when there's a big bully, the way you push back on the bully is together, and right. you start to build a coalition until you sort of overcome the bully. But it does take leadership. I think the one other thing that I'll just say, Matt, is I think that we're in a world right now where, and I understand it certainly, where if someone sticks their neck out on an issue and takes leadership, sometimes they get a lot of blowback and they get ostracized for it. And then they get judged on every other issue that maybe has nothing to do with that specific thing. And I think that that is something that I would caution people who do want to make progress in gun reform, is that, right now we're in an era where if you do see a Republican person step forward and really come to the table and say, I want to work on this, welcome them to the table. I think. I see.
Okay,
those voices matter.
So in other words,
does that make sense?
Yeah. So in other words, you're saying that if a person is somewhere where, let's say, gun reformers are not, and they on another issue, and then they get dismissed, correct, even though on this issue they might be an ally, basically, or they
Correct.
have something interesting to say. Just because you disagree, well, first of all, I agree with you 1,000% on this one, which is, we say this all the time. It's okay to disagree. Not everybody feels the same way on every issue. That's fine, right? Being violent about it and all that is not fine. But being vocal about it and discussing it and talking about it is okay. So, for example, if you're talking about Congresswoman Mason, I'm not that familiar with her, but I know you know her, and she is open to a conversation on gun issues, great. I mean, not everybody needs to agree on tax issues, foreign policy issues. There are lots of issues that we disagree on. That's okay. It's okay to have those conversations. Not everybody has to agree all the time, but we do have to have civilized dialogue.
Yeah, and look, I've, when Senator Cornyn stepped up, I applauded him for it. I thought he deserved the credit. There's a lot of criticism that, it wasn't enough, and I was like, one step at a time.
Right.
It was something.
Right. Right. And he did that, and he did the smart thing, Olivia, which was he surveyed Republicans to see where they stood, and he found out that they were okay with gun reforms. And like you said, you don't get the perfect all the time. In this case, you get the good, and it's a step in the right direction. Let's see how it plays out. But yes, Senator Cornyn certainly deserves credit for what he did. Totally agree. So, Olivia, thank you for joining us today. Much appreciated. We'll see you soon. Thank you for being a guest on TAG.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
And now for Dr. Siegel with Siegel Scope.
Thanks, Matt, and welcome to another edition of Siegel Scope. In the past, we've been talking about a special gun law platform that we put out that has really 3 very simple laws that we think could make a big difference on reducing firearm homicide rates by up to 20%. Today, I want to talk about several aspects of the platform or several types of policies that were not in the platform. And there were a number of reasons why they weren't in the platform. Some laws we left out because we just thought they weren't effective based on the research. Other laws were left out because there just isn't a lot of support for them among gun owners. And the goal of our project was to try to find common ground and then build this platform off of that common ground. But there are a few laws that were left out that have at least moderate support among gun owners, and which the research shows may be effective in reducing gun violence. So today I want to take the time to just very briefly talk about the aspects or the laws that were not in the policy, and just briefly discuss what their value may be, and why it may be that they should be considered as additional laws. The first law that's not in the platform should be considered are limitations on high-capacity ammunition magazines. And the reason for that is simply that there is a very robust evidence that these laws may reduce the number of casualties in the event of a mass shooting. They won't most likely prevent mass shootings, but in the event of a mass shooting, having access to a large capacity ammunition magazine allows the shooter to shoot many, many times before having to reload. And it's when the shooter reloads that very often there's an opportunity to intervene or for people to escape. And so that's why we think that this law should at least be considered in the setting of trying to reduce casualties in mass shootings. Second area of law that we didn't include in the platform were laws to protect children from unintentional shootings, such as gun storage laws and child access protection laws. One of the major reasons we didn't include the gun storage laws is that the gun owners we talked to and interviewed did not like the idea of having kind of a single size fits all policy, a prescribed way that you have to store your guns. And under any conditions, even if there are no children in the household. There's another approach that seems more consistent with what gun owners favor, and that is what are called child access protection laws. And basically what those laws say are, we're not going to tell you how to store your guns. You're adults, you can figure out on your own how you want to store your guns and what kind of safety precautions you need to take. But in the case that you don't store your guns properly and you end up storing them negligently and a child does access a gun and ends up using it, we are going to hold you responsible for damages that may be that may result from that. There are different variations of the law. In some cases, liability comes in if the child merely accesses the gun, even if they don't use it. In other cases, the liability only comes in if the child uses the gun. But these child access protection laws have been shown pretty convincingly, I think, to reduce the number of unintentional gun injuries. The third area is the law for purchasing guns. Right now, 18-year-olds can buy rifles and so-called assault weapons. 21, you need to be 21 to buy a handgun, although if you buy from an unlicensed dealer, you can actually buy handguns at the age of 18. One thing that policymakers may want to consider is raising the age uniformly to 21 for the purchase of all guns. I think if you did that, you would want to have an exception for 18 to 20-year-olds who are either serving in the military or have served in the military, and also for specific situations where young people are in training or, for example, supervised hunting or supervised or training in sport shooting. Two more areas that I want to talk about. One is the issue of ghost guns. We did not include banning ghost guns in this policy. And part of the reason for that is after talking to lots of gun owners, we came to the conclusion that right now the technology is not such that it's very easy to make these guns and that the guns are very effective. So you're actually more likely to be shot by an actual, normally manufactured gun than by a ghost gun because the technology for the ghost guns is not that great. Secondly, it is already illegal under federal law to manufacture a gun without a serial number. So depending on whether the person is considered a manufacturer, may or may not influence whether or not they're able to produce these guns legally. But I think the biggest thing is that we're really not aware of evidence that ghost guns are being used to kill people, to commit violence. Most of the time, because of the technology involved and the expense involved, these are used by people who are, say, for recreational purposes or people who are just aficionados of guns and they just, want to get their hands on and do it themselves. And then the final law that we didn't include in the platform is actually the repeal of stand your ground laws. There's fairly good evidence that stand your ground laws are associated with a small increase in gun violence. It's not a large increase, but it is detectable. But the most important problem, I think, with stand your ground laws is the racial discrimination that they cause. It basically provides an opportunity for people who are white to get off the hook for killing Black people in situations where if a Black person killed a white person, they would not be able to get off the hook for that. We saw George Zimmerman in Florida after killing Trayvon Martin invoked Florida's stand your ground law as a protection, legal protection against prosecution for that crime. And so repealing stand your ground laws, I think, makes sense. And again, none of these are at the level that I would consider them priorities that we have to, get every legislature to focus on this today. But I think these are important considerations that will add to the improvement of the public health. Back to you, Matt.
I'm Matthew Littman, your host of TAG. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did, we'd love for you to subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and tell your friends about us. You can find more episodes of Tag on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. Give us a follow on Instagram and Twitter at 97%org and tag who you'd like us to chat with next. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.